Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness. Adapted from the novelization by J.R. Millward. Based on an original story by A. Murty Schofield. With J.R. Millward and Adam Coover. With music by Peter Connolly and Martin Iverson. Episode 7.
I lost track of time. There have been many instances when such a thing has happened to me, deep in the bowels of some temple or other. Isolated from external cues, we can adopt some very strange biological rhythms indeed. I knew it couldn't have been more than an hour or so since I'd entered the Hall of Seasons, as Maggie so poetically named it. But things like open air, skies, and cities began to feel like they belonged to another world. My hand cupped an off-white crystal, hefting its weight before placing it into its socket. The images surrounding this alcove were serene, dreamlike, clouds and the changing hues of the horizon. What utter bullshit. I had bruises everywhere it was physically possible to get them from recovering the damn wind crystal. It had involved treacherous leaps from the tops of poles cut from ancient pines, bending and creaking above a terminally deep pit to reach a narrow ledge where the crystal rested. Gusts of gale-force wind from completely random directions had assaulted me as I'd made each jump, funneled from the mouths of monstrous stone heads ranged around the walls. They had reminded me of Chinese temple dogs, right down to the rankness of their breath that sought to buffet and unsteady me. My ears still ached from the creaking of the poles as they swayed underfoot, like the ghost of a tea clipper running full sail through the Straits of Magellan. I was shivering and queasy when I returned to the hall and placed the crystal next to its neighbours for fire and water. Water. At least there I had been fortunate. Those dank and dripping chambers would have posed much more of a problem if their traps hadn't rusted into immobile lumps long ago. It had taken a lot of patience and all my training in deep breathing, but at least I hadn't been skewered, bent or crushed by the arrays of menacing spikes and blades. A few forlorn-looking fish had been the crystal's only guardians, but I still couldn't shake off the feeling that my every move was being watched. The cobalt blue stone shimmered in its socket as I scanned the alcoves, and returned once more to activate the final doorway. My clothes had mostly dried out after my sojourn in the wind room, but my boots squelched with every step. Earth. It can't be any worse than fire, can it? I wish you hadn't said that. Every bloody time you jinx it by saying, it can't get any worse. You can practically guarantee it. Enough whining. I know what I'm doing. Anyway, this is the last one. The painting can't be far away now. Dust motes swirled in the rays of light from the hall, guiding my way down a set of shallow steps into the largest room I'd seen yet. Bigger than the other elemental chambers, or even the main hall. The air was chilly and fetid with the smell of an old grave. I froze, almost swallowing my tongue. A giant towered ahead of me, across an acre of tiled floor. Its gaze was fixed upon me, its shining black eyes filled with demonic intelligence. Vast wings stretched out to its side, and its lordly head was crowned by two curling horns. Twin globes of flames sputtered and smoked in its outstretched hands, the ash drifting up and veiling the creature's snarling face in haze. Only then did I realize it was a statue. Uncertainty gripped me, although my fear eased considerably. Years ago, I'd fought a bull Tyrannosaurus. Don't ask. A predator 3 times my height that could have cheerfully swallowed me whole. But he would have looked as ludicrous as a Yorkshire Terrier next to this monster. My inner voice, as always, swooped in and lent me her courage. Steady, girl. Take it nice and slow. There's no reason to expect it to come alive, just because it looks so lifelike. See? There's the crystal, down there between its ankles. You just need to ease... Watch out! A tremendous barrage shook the chamber, louder than several express trains colliding. I was knocked over, unable to keep my balance as the floor suddenly bucked like an angry horse. The tiles seemed to ripple, disintegrating before my eyes. Great sections collapsed, tumbling down and smashing against each other with terrifying violence. Holding onto the steps for dear life, I watched in horror as the statue shuddered and broke apart under the strain. The fires tumbled from its hands and were extinguished, its body shattering into car-sized pieces until at last the great head itself toppled off the shoulders and crashed through the floor. Almost as quickly as they had begun, the tremors ceased. I stood, brushing myself off, and struggled to see through the dust cloud that hung over the remains of the floor. Great rents and fissures had torn it apart. Unsettling sounds echoed from the depths, as though the remains of the once grand chamber were being welcomed and tormented by the denizens of hell. Oh boy. See? I told you. But oh no, you had to open your big mouth. Oh, shut up. Okay, you're my subconscious. Okay, you sometimes make very valid points. But right now I need to concentrate. And that means giving me space, right? Hey, you're not actually going to... You're the one who gives my heroism a kick up the arse. Watch me. Truth be told, I was counting on bravura more than actual confidence. There have been many times when I've acted spontaneously and with more than a fair share of recklessness, despite the fact that inwardly I might be trembling in my boots. The gaping abyss held plenty of terrors for me. Memories of being buried alive aren't something a woman can brush idly away. But if I didn't face them now, then when? I landed exactly where I'd intended to, but had barely enough time to think as the stone beneath my feet shuddered and began falling. Adrenaline coursed through me, lending me supercharged strength to leap to safety. My perception sharpened, judging distance perfectly. I felt my brain buzz as white-hot reflexes seared through muscle and sinew, dodging tumbling rocks and vaulting across gaping pits with ease. There was no time to analyze, no time to be cautious and rational. This was the other side of my exploits I had always loved. The daring, the adventure, the hair's breadth roller coaster with death snapping at my heels. I was laughing as I made the last jump, confident in the knowledge I had finally reunited with my true self. And missed. My fingers brushed the last column, but I simply didn't have enough momentum to reach the other side. I screamed, scrabbling the air in my sudden terror, feeling the chasm yawn open to devour me. I don't know how I grabbed the outcrop, or how such a tiny ledge held my weight. The earth trembling vibrated through my fingers, my palms becoming slick with sweat. I was choking on the dust that seemed to be swirling everywhere.
Quickly, girl, before it collapses around you!
No. No, not again! You're dead!
No time! Your hand! Lara, give me your hand!
Werner! You can't be here! I saw you killed! What are you doing here?
I can pull you to safety!
You're not real! You can't be real! A shape stirred in the gloom. I felt a hot wind embracing me, smelling of the desert and painful memories.
Lara.
You again. Why are you doing this to me?
Surely even you can see you are doing it to yourself.
I don't understand.
Dear Lara, after all you've seen and done, are you still going to let this hold you back?
I was standing upright on the expensive parquet floor of Werner's apartment, watching my mentor argue as the thunder rumbled outside.
5 obscure paintings for a client called Eckhart.
His frailty and fear dawned on me with fresh empathy, as I saw my earlier self growing more and more bitter, cutting herself off from his distress.
Please, you've got to help me. For pity's sake.
I'm going. Egypt, Werner. You walked away and left me. There was no pity then.
Get out!
You wouldn't have come to Paris at all if you hadn't begun to forgive him.
You think? I'm hunting his killer as we speak. Of course I've forgiven him.
Indeed. But have you thought about whether your motives are pure?
Why are you so concerned?
Because you might not realize when your desire for justice turns into need for revenge. You may choose either, but vengeance will not help you to forgive Von Croy for abandoning you.
How will I know the difference?
You will know. Your healing is going well. By the time the choice comes, you will know.
The rock beneath my fingers solidified. I opened my eyes and swung myself up the last few inches, pulling myself to solid ground, just as the last of the columns tumbled into the depths. My heart was pounding. Sweat clung to me in a clammy, dust-coated second skin as I lay, regaining a measure of control after the rush of hormones. My water bottle brought welcome relief as I swilled the dust from my mouth and drank gratefully, wondering if it was godly prerogative to pester people only during life-or-death struggles. Perhaps my desire for closure had been too eager, too soon. The similarity between this place and my near-death experience back in Egypt were too close for my unconscious mind to ignore. I just had to hope he was right. The earth crystal shone with sickly green foxfire and seemed to pulse like a beating heart as I plucked it from its resting place. I hadn't bothered to wonder until now how I would get back to the hall across the now enormous pit. But as soon as I tucked the stone inside my backpack, the choice was made for me. crystalline chiming filled the chamber, swiftly growing in volume until, to my astonishment, the abyss dissolved in churning mist the colour of maple syrup. Fragments of stone rose from the haze and swirled in formation like a flock of starlings until they arranged themselves into a new floor, even more grand and elaborate than the last one. Cautious, but inwardly fascinated, I crept forwards and tested the nearest edge with my foot. It held my weight. You know what you said earlier about impatience? Well, it certainly seems a good piece of advice. I've got another one for you, Maggie. He who hesitates is lost. To my eternal surprise and delight, the floor did not collapse and plunge me to a violent death. Relief washed its cooling balm over me, as refreshing as stepping into a tropical shower. In retrospect, I should have known better than to let my guard down. An assemblage of bones and rusted armour stood on guard before me, the very collection I had demolished earlier with the door. It staggered as I pushed past, its headless body searching for the source of the noise. The broadsword raised sparks as it scraped along the ground, and its owner turned, rising for another swipe. It had almost decapitated me with that first swing, but this time I was ready. I popped a dozen shells into its torso before it could complete the maneuver. Decent 9mm rounds this time, not the expensive shock darts. With an unearthly wail, the body tripped backwards and fell. Pieces flew everywhere, with a noise like someone dropping an accordion. I felt like laughing. It seemed I still had my touch. My foot nudged the pile of bones, and for the first time I noticed the arrow-like emblem sewn on the surcoat. The Lux Veritatis. It looks like the same symbol in Werner's journal, doesn't it? Must be some sort of reanimation curse. Everyone seems to have their own brand of it to discourage people like us. Not that it works. Oh, so suddenly the love of violence makes a comeback. Shall I tick it off the list? You know as well as I do, Maggie, that museum guards and police are one thing, and undead fiends born of unholy magic are quite another. Now be quiet and let me focus. We both know these places like to spring traps at the smallest provocation. We both held our breath as I fitted the crystal into its socket. The greenish glow flared like a winking eye. Do you feel something? The tremors began through the soles of my feet, a vibration as distant as a laden truck passing the other side of the street. A clanking sound echoed up from somewhere beneath the floor, as though ancient machinery was groaning painfully into life. Clockwork and hydraulics, heavy with rust and the neglect of centuries. Dust drifted down from the ceiling, coating my shoulders and upraised eyelashes. Lamps swayed fitfully, throwing ghoulish shadows across the walls. Transfixed, I could only watch as those exquisite tableaux of gemstones and loving artistry set into the floor began to rise. Each panel crept upwards on columns, higher and higher, driven ceilingward by hidden ingenuity and engineer's cunning. Then, just as smoothly, they descended, each pillar appearing to bow to its neighbours, before coming to a hovering pause around my eye level and beginning their stately journey once more. The floor was a staircase, one that only the most intrepid, or foolhardy, would dare to climb. At the very top of the chamber, at the dome's zenith, was an opening I had not noticed before. It was an oculus, a circular skylight, common in classical architecture from the 1500s onwards. Some forgotten disaster had claimed the upper balcony and sheared off a section of architecture the size of a double-decker bus. One torchlight shone through the hole, beckoning, tempting. So, I guess the painting has got to be up there somewhere. Oh well, onwards and upwards. It wasn't hard to haul myself onto the lowest pillar. It seemed to float, adjusting to my added weight, and then began rising again. I kept my center of gravity low, taking care not to slip on the onyx and jade tableau of Scorpio, its tail poised to strike. Patiently, I waited for the next pillar to drop into range, then the next, and the next. Sagittarius, Taurus, Gemini. Works that any Renaissance craftsman would have been privileged to create, and even more distraught to see me trampling all over. At last, the pillar's journey terminated within reach of the great iron chandelier. Without hesitation, I stepped lightly up and threw my arms out for balance. Heat frazzled my senses as I picked my way across the tallow-encrusted metal until, with considerable relief, I could vault over the low balustrade and onto the balcony. It was Maggie who saved my sight. The wall exploded. Chips of marble sliced my upraised forearms. My unconscious had instinctively thrown them up to cover my eyes before I even registered what was happening. Half blinded by dust, I stumbled to avoid chunks of stone the size of my body. Coughing, I scooted backwards on my backside, training my guns on the shambling figure that had broken free of its entombment. It spotted me, hissed a challenge, and swung its greatsword at my unprotected flank. I hate being made to feel unwelcome. Howling a war cry of my own, I lashed out and shattered its kneecaps with an awkward kick. Rotting teeth and stinking chain mail toppled forwards, descending with a furious gargle to crush me. At the last moment, I rolled to one side, emptying my guns through the slit in its helm. Scrambling, I leapt to my feet, not waiting for it to rise. The thing clawed at my retreating footsteps as the Lux Veritatis arrow emblem flapped on its torn circlet. Persistent bugger, aren't you? I reloaded with grim intent, backing away to safety. Or so I thought. As if the night's growls had been a signal, the stone walls along the entire length of the balcony rumbled and broke apart as more Lux Veritatis guardians emerged from their slumber. In seconds, the sweeping crescent of the balcony became littered with hunks of masonry. A choking cloud of dust reduced the approaching figures to little more than shadows and baleful, glowing eyes. There were no more stairs, no doorways. I was cornered. Damn it. Any ideas? They don't seem to notice being shot at. So I can see. The guardian with the broken legs and bullet-ridden skull emerged from the gloom. Its splintered bones reattached any which way. Its steps were faltering, but nothing less than pure, implacable hatred powered its movements. In a heartbeat, the other knights drew their swords in unison and took up the cry. A sound that would have emptied the bladders of lesser men. Bringing back the dead isn't difficult. I've encountered the practice several times in one form or another. But preserving a body's purpose and will is another matter entirely. Whatever power was being employed by the Lux Veritatis, it was pretty high-quality stuff. Only in Egypt and a handful of Chinese tombs had I seen reanimated corpses with such initiative and persistence. My thoughts automatically seized on the lump of C4 still in my backpack. But I doubted even that would slow them all down for long. My back thudded against the wall. The crossbow dug into my shoulder blades and I unslung it, ready to wield it like a club. Fighting isn't an option. They're going to pick you off if you stay here. Climb! Climb! Cursing, I reslung the crossbow and scanned for a route up the almost sheer surface. The handholds were crumbling and spaced too far apart for comfort. But I wasn't about to argue. I'd barely hoisted myself up when the nearest corpse reached me. The tiled wall yielded to his rusting sword as easily as butter, his swing missing me by millimeters. Higher and higher I climbed, my spine arching as I traversed the curving face of the dome. More than once, my handholds gave way, dissolving into grit that stung my eyes. Gravity increased with brutal efficiency, tugging at my burning shoulders. The crossbow thumped against my backside with every motion, and the added weight made me sweat. Why had I thought it would be a good idea to bring it along? At last, impossibly, I dragged my aching body through the oculus and rolled onto stone. Wonderful, cool, solid stone. Never again. Never again. Well, at least we're better off than that lunatic with the diary. Maybe. I allowed myself a rueful smile. It was sobering to feel the difference in my body. 2 years ago, I wouldn't even have broken a sweat for a climb like that. Still, there was no sense in being overly critical. I had survived, and my enemies were now fruitlessly venting their frustration instead of hacking me into bite-sized pieces. That was definitely something to feel thankful for. While I paused to catch my breath, I suddenly felt a deep relief that Werner had not attempted to retrieve the painting himself. It would have been suicidal for a man in his condition to even contemplate gaining entry into this tomb, let alone defeat its guardians. Once, perhaps, he would have done so, and hired a battalion of thugs to do the dirty work for him. However, with his perceived need for secrecy, and the terror of Eckhart breathing down his neck, not to mention his physical frailty, it would have been unthinkable for the old man to even try. My heart softened. Regardless of our history, he'd done the right thing, asking for my help. The space above the oculus was a low-ceilinged, narrow hallway choked with cobwebs. The only light came from a flight of steep stairs, a single torch that only seemed to make the shadows deeper. After my experiences of the chambers below, I was surprised by such incongruous simplicity. Perhaps I'd come to the wrong place. At the top of the stairs, however, I realized my doubts were unjustified. I felt like I was stepping into the nave of a Gothic church. Bronze braziers sat between stout granite pillars and gave off a cloying smoke that crept over the bowls to trickle down across the floor like sluggish ghosts. Their ruddy glow did not extend very far, and the ceiling was lost in vaulted, inky darkness. A monk, carved from black basalt, stood directly facing the door, his hands proffering a fantastically polished marble plaque like a herald displaying his lord's emblem at a tournament. 4 more identical statues stood at intervals around the room, their impassive faces turned to the walls as though watchful for intruders. My eyes narrowed. In the centre of the choking haze, on a raised dais, stood 6 more statues upon whose shoulders rested a sarcophagus. All were chiselled from more of the coal-black stone, except for the marble skulls in place of the pallbearers' faces. Perhaps the most striking feature of the room, however, was the trench of smouldering embers that encircled the entire dais. It cut across the floor like a crack in lava, subtly threatening a boundary that should not be crossed. The glow of firelight made the statue's eye sockets seem to flicker, and lipless smiles stretch into hellish grins. There was no sign of the painting anywhere. As I have already mentioned, impatience is not a virtue in my line of work. The trick is to examine every detail, not to jump to conclusions based on just a cursory examination. I've lost count of the number of archaeological sites that others have visited and dismissed as worthless, only for me to come along and point out the hidden meanings staring them in the face. A hair-lined crack can be a door, a pebble out of place can mark a tripwire, or a riddle of broken hieroglyphs can warn you not to feed the crocodiles. No joke, those ancient Egyptians had a twisted sense of humour. With all this in mind, it will come as no surprise that I entered with the utmost caution. Surprisingly, all the statue's plaques were blank, with nothing to suggest identity or purpose. The sarcophagus was a different matter. Words were carved into the sarcophagus's flanks, under a light covering of dust that I easily brushed away. Brother Matthew Obscura, 1445. That's the monk who was supposed to have painted over the original Obscura paintings. I wonder if Carvier knew he was buried here. The rest of the text is in Latin. Ultra vigilis umbram, ecce veritas. Through the spirit of the keeper, behold the truth. What could that possibly mean? My vision exploded in scarlet, fractured agony. I was shoved back, cracking my skull on stone. The temperature plummeted, freezing my eyelids shut. The air in my lungs crystallized with sickening speed, as though I'd swallowed broken glass. For a hideous moment, I was back, under the pyramid, lost under crushing darkness, helpless and broken, about to die. An unearthly shriek pierced my delirium, thrusting me back into full consciousness. I've done some things I'm not proud of, but I'm sure my afterlife wouldn't contain sounds like that. Something vaguely man-shaped blurred past, hovering just out of reach. Coldness emanated from it like a doorway into Antarctica. Frost clung to my eyelashes and numbed my outstretched fingers. Again, that eldritch scream crucified my ears. Like a demon who had unearthed the legal papers from the fall and learned who had sold them out. I avoided its touch by a whisker, banging against a pillar in my haste to get away. Stars exploded across my vision. The howling, wailing apparition sailed past, circling to the far side of the chamber. I came to, lying scant inches from the smouldering trench. Its warmth caressed me, thawing me out. I regained my senses, but one blinking mote of light refused to disappear. It was the plaque of the statue in front of me, its form suddenly alive with a twinkling blue halo. I shook my head, refusing to be distracted by concussion-induced hallucinations. But I hadn't imagined it. In the center of the radiance was a painting. The painting, capital P. The spectre circled toward me for another assault. The braziers went out, one by one, as it floated past, its unnatural aura sapping the flame's energy. Stupefied, I realized the truth. The fiery trench wasn't there for decoration or defense. It was a prison. The spectre couldn't sustain itself without the constant heat. I had a chance. For God's sake, Lara, just grab it and run. Discretion and valor? The ghost hovered, choosing its moment. Its tattered robes flapped in disturbing patterns, as though blown by winds not of this earth. I tried to predict its motion, but there was nothing remotely human about its movements. Its eyes were like burn holes in the fabric of reality. I made the mistake of meeting its gaze, and had my second epiphany in less than a minute. Memory overwhelmed me, scored deep with teenage emotions. The sour, sweet smell of mold and mildew. The drip, drip, drip of rain leaking through rotting thatch. For the space of a heartbeat, I was thrust back to a dark and gusty night in a forgotten chapel, lost somewhere in the Irish Sea. I'd seen this ghost before. There was no time to think about that now. I tore my gaze away, angrily, pushing the thoughts aside. Maggie would help me understand the connection, if there was one, some other time, if I managed to get us out of here. I fainted left. My dodge turned into a roll, the spectre missing me by inches. A blast of cold pushed me to my feet, and I made a blind grab for the painting. My hand tingled as though electrified, but grasped at something solid. The painting was barely the size of Werner's notebook. Even as my fingers tightened around its frame, the ghost swooped down for another attack. I didn't look back. Clutching my prize, I dodged the statue, upending a brazier and scattering hot coals. A desperate leap took me over the trench's boundary, through the yawning doorway to safety. At the last moment, I pulled my long braid out of the way as the door clanged shut. The ghost's scream of rage must have been heard all over Paris.
In episode 7 of Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness, Lara Croft was played by J.R. Millward. Horace and Professor Von Croy were played by Adam Coover. Written and adapted by J.R. Millward. Based on an original story by A. Murty Schofield. With music by Peter Connolly and Martin Iverson. Additional sound effects courtesy of www.freesfx.co.uk and the BBC. Produced by Stephen Millward. Lara Croft and Tomb Raider are the property of Crystal Dynamics and Square Enix.